Welcome. My name is Len Lane, and I am the founder and president of Brokers for Life, Inc., and we are Dominion Lending Centers in Western Canada. The topic of our podcast will be about what we consider to be real-life mortgage solutions. Today, we are talking with Brandon Hans, partner, Barr LLP, barrister and solicitor in beautiful downtown Edmonton. We're kind of chilly today. We're going to talk about foreclosure and the process that happens during foreclosure. So, Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Len. I'm happy to be here.
I guess right into the nitty gritty foreclosure. No one ever wants to see it. We see it on credit bureaus every now and then that something's gone awry. So, what is it for the client that actually triggers foreclosure?
Well, I think it's probably worthwhile to talk about what a foreclosure is before you can talk about triggering. A lot of times when I have clients come into my office, either for foreclosures or if they're lenders or if they're even just buying a house, I hear the same joke that when you take a mortgage out, basically the bank or the lender owns the property, and that's simply not the case. So foreclosure is really a lender's resort against the property if a debt is either in default or is not paid. So, put simply, it is a way to offload the property that might be owned by one party without that party's permission. And so it's basically a forced sale. It's been called various things throughout Alberta's history specifically, but every province has their own version of foreclosure. And it's basically a lender goes to a court and says to a judge, I'm a lender, I'm owed a certain amount of money. The borrower has defaulted under the terms of our loan in some way, and I'd like to sell the property to recover the money that I'm owed. Most of the time, that foreclosure is done for fair market value. This is why you'd have appraisals and real estate agents involved. And there's a process that's put in place through the foreclosure laws in each jurisdiction that protects borrowers as much as they can, but still allows for the orderly sale of property. And so that's broadly speaking what a foreclosure is. And the reason you might have a foreclosure are numerous. And it'll depend specifically whether or not it's a residential mortgage or if it's a commercial mortgage. Could be different if it's a private mortgage. But broadly speaking, it's just a breach of the terms of a loan. And so the biggest one, obviously, is making payments. That's kind of the most common breach you'd see in loans. But, I've handled a foreclosure of a golf course at one time that was subject to flood damage. So a river overflowed and flooded this golf course, and the golf course failed to take steps to remediate the lands to get it back to a going concern. And so obviously, if you have a golf course that grows out for years and years and years, it's harder to bring it back to a point where you could sell it. And so that was deemed to be a breach of the loan under the kind of often unused failure to maintain the land clause in a charge. So it can be kind of anything, really. The most common ones that we see when it comes to foreclosures are obviously the making payments, but then there's kind of the laundry list of owner responsibilities. Keeping the property insured is a big one. As the property burns down and it's uninsured, bank faces a pretty significant loss. And then there's failure to pay property taxes, failures to pay condominium fees. In situations where you might have first and second position lenders, it'd be failure to pay the first position lender or the second position lender, wherever that may be. Properties abandoned, properties used for something it's not intended. And so, it's not common that this happens, but if somebody buys a residence and tries to convert it to a restaurant or something like that, that technically would violate your mortgage, right? Because it's not what it was underwritten for. And so those are all kind of broad triggers as to what causes a foreclosure. Most of the time when people go and see their lawyer and they sign the mortgage, the lawyer will have this rather long, usually 30-page document that they give to the client, and they say, this is what you're signing on to when you sign the mortgage. It's almost like the iTunes agreement for a loan. And most of the time, people don't read them unless something goes wrong, and kind of all the triggers of a foreclosure are found in that document. And that kind of outlines specifically what the foreclosure does. So yeah, it's numerous. It's not a one size fits all type of trigger, but yeah.
Yeah, just even thinking of that failure to maintain, I'm assuming that would not just be a golf course. That would apply to regular residential as well. When think about it.
Yeah, it could. Like let's say you had a property and it was tenanted, and the tenants trash the entire inside of the house. Well, if that damage is not remediated, then that would also be a trigger, right? And so the way to think of it is the lender's security, and it doesn't matter if this is a bank or a trust company or a MIC or anyone who's lending money, the bank's security is tied up to the value of the house or value of the property. If the property can't sell, or it sells for less than what the appraised value should be, the bank or the lender will be upset in that situation. So, I often tell people, if you've got mold damage, you got to remediate the mold damage. If a tree falls up through the roof through a windstorm, you got to fix the roof. Like, these are things that you probably would normally do as an owner in any event, but should be done as a matter of course for their mortgage as well.
Right. We have seen people probably more times than I can count over the last 18 years that have come in and said, I'm buying this house and then I'm going to tear it down and build another house. And I'm going, okay, does the bank know you're going to do that?
Yeah.
You can't just tear it down. You have a mortgage. You're going to have a mortgage on it, and you have to. We have to work out a better plan than what you have at the moment. So.
Yeah, and to that point, I have a lot of clients come through and say, yeah, I'm planning on doing some significant renovations to this property. Well, that's also a trigger of a foreclosure. If you go into a property and you start banging out walls, and you take out a load-bearing wall and you don't know, that renovation in its own right could be a breach of the loan, because the bank wants to make sure that the roof's not going to cave in on you, which is another thing entirely. And frankly, when it comes to lenders being involved in the transaction, they often don't say no. Bigger lenders may. So if you wanted to bring in a partner onto a loan, let's say you bought a property individually and you want to bring your husband or your wife onto title, well, that technically is a breach of the loan as well, and that would trigger a foreclosure if that person hasn't been vetted by the bank. And so basically, as long as you kind of stay within the bounds of your loan agreement, then there shouldn't be a foreclosure. And I say shouldn't because I've had situations in the commercial side where a borrower has never missed a payment, but got ensnared in a COVID loan, of which the federal government, erroneously called a COVID loan back, which was under appeal, and had the bank foreclose under the property, even though they'd never missed a payment. And so, it gets a little bit more complicated when you have more money involved. But for the average residential property, foreclosures are usually missed payments. Everything else can all usually be fixed.
Yeah, it seems that missed payment thing is pretty much 95% of what we see. So at what point do you become involved? And from your standpoint, is it more that you're involved with the mortgagor or the mortgagee?
That's a good question. There's no specific answers when a lawyer gets involved. Smaller lenders or maybe monoline lenders, tier B lenders, they generally get involved quicker. Generally, the security is not as good, and they often hire lawyers who are pit bulls, I guess. People who don't necessarily want to work to sort out a problem, but they just want to run through the motions. And they can be very difficult to deal with, even when I'm a lawyer dealing with them, right? So those types of lenders get involved a lot quicker. If it's a kind of a major tier A bank or a big monoline lender like a First National, they often don't get involved until there's several months of missed payments and several letters. They give a lot of leeway for people to kind of dig their way out of problems. And if you have private lenders generally engage lawyers as soon as there's a missed payment, because they need some coaching to run through the enforcement procedure that might not be required for a larger lender. And so, it really depends who the lender is as to when the lawyer gets involved. Now, when it comes to what I do, let's back up here. Big lenders have lots of foreclosures. The bigger the lender, the more foreclosures they have. And so someone like Toronto Dominion generally needs a team of lawyers handle foreclosure matters kind of day in, day out, day in, day out. And so, those are bigger law firms that have, a rather large litigation support team, and they go from there. The smaller lender you get, or the more boutique type of loan it is, you more engage with somebody like me who does, the placement of the loan as well as the enforcement or potentially defense of the loan. And so you often will see more lawyers involved, the more dollars involved. In terms of who I represent, or who lawyers mostly represent, they often don't represent the borrower, right? So the mortgagor in the situation, the person borrowing the money, if they've missed their mortgage payments, they very rarely have the money to pay a lawyer to handle a defense. And weirdly enough, out of all the litigation you'll see, foreclosures are very rarely something you can defend against, right? So if if you've not made your payments, there's not really a defense to that non-payment. Really, the only defense would be one, fraud. I didn't sign this mortgage. You're trying to enforce against me, and I'm not the borrower. Or two, your numbers are all wrong. I paid you back. But then you get into the issue. Some people try to allege that I paid you back with a promissory note, or I signed under a different name. These are kind of conspiracy theories to try and get out of debts. They don't really work, but people still try them. And so, yeah, there's really not much of a defense to it. And so even if I have clients call me with money saying, what do I do here? The best we normally do is what's called a forbearance agreement, which is a kind of a pause to the foreclosure proceedings to allow a refinance to go through. Right. So I had one that we closed late January. A client came to me. They had a couple of apartment buildings. They were in a foreclosure. They actually already had a new lender lined up, and they just needed some time to cross the T's and dot the I's. And so we ended up executing an agreement which paused the action. The clock still ran in interest, but no legal fees accrued, and gave us time to complete the takeout financing. So that's what you mostly see lawyers coming involved in on the borrower side is kind of delays and payouts.
So once the action has started for the homeowner, are there many? Obviously, the ramifications are against your credit. Obviously, we see that from time to time. A foreclosure on your credit with a CMHC involved is a kiss of death for mortgages. You ever are able to buy something with less than 20% down, and most likely you'll end up in the private world for quite some time, because CMHC is like the elephant. They do not forget that they share that information with us agent, and can be guarantee. I'm not sure what Breakfast Club that is, but it's that never goes away, it seems, for the homeowner, unfortunately. So
Yeah, that certainly is one of the main ramifications, but it's a little bit more than that too. Like, the kind of the glaring thing for the homeowner is you lose your house, right? Like that's kind of, you're out in the street. But you also got to remember too that under most mortgages, the provisions in the mortgage allow for all the collection costs by the lender to be added to the debt. So if you have equity in your property, and you let it go through foreclosure, you end up paying the foreclosing lawyer, the foreclosing realtor, foreclosing appraiser, any property managers they inspect. And so, like, you basically pay the bank to see yourself in a foreclosure. And so, biggest piece of advice that I would have to people in that situation is like, as soon as you're behind and you're behind, don't let it get to a foreclosure. Get it paid out, or get it refinanced, or get it sold, to avoid that hit on your credit rating and to avoid paying money when you really shouldn't have to pay it out. So,
right, I'm sure that and when it's a team on the other end, if it's TDE or something like that, that they accumulate costs very quickly. It's and of course the interest never really stops on it at all, right?
yeah, well, and it's also it's weird because different jurisdictions have different rules. So in the Calgary market, the courts have adopted effectively like a tariff guide for foreclosing lawyers. And so they generally will not allow charges to go beyond that tariff. In Edmonton, it's a little different. In Edmonton, they don't really have that tariff, but it kind of mirrors it anyway, because a lot of those big firms operate in both of those jurisdictions. They don't really want to change their billing practices too much. But yeah, it is it can be very expensive fairly quickly.
It's always interesting to watch how quickly that adds up. So your a majority of your business, I take it, is this, and in the lending world, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tough to describe, because when you do real estate generally, and it could be residential, it could be commercial, it could be industrial. It all kind of ties into financing as well. And so my practice area is primarily real estate and financing together. So whether acting for lenders or acting for buyers or sellers, but as part of that, we also have the enforcement of these types of loans if we're acting for the lender. So it's part and parcel to kind of the real estate world. Not a lot of real estate lawyers do the lending side. It's more of a niche market because we act for a lot of private lenders, private lending institutions or organizations. We have a little bit more experience on the kind of the enforcement side than kind of the average real estate lawyer would.
Yeah, and it's I guess it's a shorter chain if it's a private lender, private individual, of course, right? One person on title having to foreclose does that take less paperwork than if it's DD Bank and you can wait
Well,
for months?
it certainly depends on the lender. So, a lot of times when you do foreclosure work for a private lender, that private lender is it's their money they're lending. It's not someone else's, and so often the record keeping is either 100% better because it's their own money, or 100% worse,
Of course.
right? And so, and a lot of times too, because nobody, it's kind of a misconception. People lending money, nobody wants to foreclose. It's messy. It takes time. You have to pay lawyers, and nobody likes lawyers. There's a chance you could go into a default or a deficiency situation where the value of the house is less than what's owed. And I know we're going to talk about that later, but nobody likes doing it, right? And so on private loans, you might be able to negotiate a larger forbearance, or you might be able to get more time to do things or side deals that you wouldn't see in a conventional loan. Doesn't mean they're not done in a conventional loan. It just means that there's a little bit more creativity that goes involved to it. So, there's a lot more things to be aware of at that point. But
Yeah, we kind of cringe when somebody's trying to buy a foreclosure because, especially if it's the bank, because the bank, I don't know what their whole process is, but on the back end, it seems to take 2 weeks to get an answer back on if they accepted the offer or anything like that. But I'm sure that's part of their overall process, and they're handling more than one file at a time as well. So,
well, it's also not necessarily the bank's fault in that situation, right? So the foreclosure process is designed to maximize the return of the sale of the property. And so the courts are kind of there standing up for the borrower saying, well, no, you can't fire sale this property. You have to sell it for fair market value. And so that means you might have to list it at a higher amount than the bank would want to. And then over time, you kind of slowly step the price down to get it to where it will actually sell. And so even though you don't get the same representations and warranties on a purchase of a foreclosed property that you would for, let's say, buying from someone who's not in foreclosure, the courts are still wanting the same price points. And so there's kind of a weird push and pull there. So there's that one there, is that the courts will have to approve any offer that you put in, and it takes time to get in front of a judge, and it costs money to file those pleadings. In addition to that, though, the courts, because in most foreclosure situations, at least before you're into a negative equity situation, it's actually the court selling the property. And so it's not the bank selling it. The bank is kind of like the facilitator of that sale, but it's the courts that are selling it, and the court can't grant you any reps and warranties because obviously the judge who's issuing the order doesn't know that there's a crack in the foundation, doesn't know that the property floods every year. Like, these are things that you'll never know. And so that's why every single offer that goes in has to be as is, where is because there's never going to be any judge who's going to walk a property that they're issuing a foreclosure on. And so there are some flags you have to keep in mind when you look to buy one of those properties. Now, that being said, there's also some deals because you're relying on real estate agents. I had a client buy a property out of a foreclosure, and he did get it at a fire sale value, and the property was actually tagged with a Alberta Health Services do not inhabit order. And so they had to do some remediation, but it turns out the property was 200 square feet larger than the listing. And so he ended up buying this property that was quite a bit larger than advertised, and he got the benefit of that. So, there is pros and cons to going through that foreclosure market, but people should most definitely talk to a lawyer before they do it, because this can be quite large swings.
yeah, no, that as is, where is always scary for lenders as well, right? It's like, what are you buying? Do you know what you're buying? And can you even you can't even get an inspection, right? It's pretty much down to,
Yeah, I mean,
there it is.
yeah, it depends too, right? Like, if the property is obviously, if they've got no offers on it, if the lender has access to the property and they've secured it, they may allow an inspection. Like, I have solicited offers or sent offers on behalf of clients to foreclosing banks with conditions, and they have been accepted. But really, that's not the norm. That's the exception, right? So it can be quite dicey on the purchasing side of things.
Yeah, there was, I had one recently come across my desk. It was a foreclosure in Fort McMurray on an apartment, and there was nothing in the apartment. Like no fixtures, no cabins. Everything had been taken out when the previous owner left with it. I guess technically that's not, it is not the way it should be, I guess. Are they, is this the owner responsible to leave it in a reasonable condition, or does it really have any?
I mean, technically they are. So when you get your foreclosure order, your sale order from the courts, it does put obligations on the owner to kind of leave it in a decent condition. But what's the risk to the borrower who has now lost their property and clearly has no money to pay any fines? And so there's not really a whole lot you can do, even if there is cut and dry or black and white liability here for the borrower. What's your remedy? A lawsuit that costs you money that you're never going to enforce. And so, I always tell people when you're buying a foreclosed property, just it is as is, whereas you don't know what the condition will be at the time of closing. Potentially, the insurance for the borrower or for the bank should cover a lot of that stuff. But then you get into an assignment of insurance proceeds. It can be kind of frustrating, to say the least.
So we can touch that a little bit there. So the property does sell, but there's a shortfall. So how does that come about? Well, it comes about obviously, but what's in the ramifications?
Well, there's effectively two different ways, and I'm making things simple here, but there's two different ways that can occur. The first one is an individual who's in a foreclosure situation is the one selling the property. So let's back up here. When a bank starts a foreclosure, they serve the documentation on the borrower, and in most situations, the court has to grant 6 months to the borrower to get their affairs in order. Whether that be refinance, sell the property, pay out the arrears, they have usually 6 months. And so a lot of times you'll see people go to sell their property within those 6 months, and they list it and it sells, but it's not enough to cover the debts, the closing costs with commissions, and any accrued interest or penalties that are applied to those loans that are on the property. And so that's kind of a foreclosures in the background, but it's a pre-foreclosure short sale. In those circumstances, there's kind of one of two things happens. One, the seller's lawyer marshals all the creditors and says, we've listed this property for fair market value. This is the highest offer we've received. Based on the priorities of registration, these are the proposed payouts. Will you consent to this short sale? It'll save us all time and money rather than have to go to court. If that's accepted, then you close. One party, usually the last person on title, takes a haircut and you move on with your life. And foreclosure is stopped, proceedings are terminated. Depending on where they are in the foreclosure process, there may not be a registration on the credit bureau. Probably not if it's in the early stages. Second option, you marshal your creditors and then somebody says, no, I'm not willing to consent to this. Well, at that point, if you have the money to hire a lawyer to do this, or if you're willing to do it yourself, you basically bring an application to the court saying, I'm the seller, these are the creditors, this is the fair market value. Judge, can I have permission to sell my own house? The repercussions here only impact this creditor who would get less money if they went through a foreclosure, so this doesn't make a lot of sense. And a judge will say yes or no. If they say no, the deal is permanent. If they say yes, then notwithstanding that you don't have consent, you kind of move ahead. But you'll have to have paid a lawyer to do that. So that's kind of your in-process foreclosure or in foreclosure process short sale without the banks involved. If you get to a position where you're a bank and you're lending money and you're doing your foreclosure and it turns out your property is underwater, then there's kind of two things that happen. The first one is usually what's called an order for sale to plaintiff. And what this does is it transfers the property from the existing owner to the bank as if they were a buyer in exchange for the debt that they're owed. Okay, So the property transfers fully to the bank. It becomes the bank's property, and then they can do what they want with it. They can list it, they can renovate it, they can wholesale it, and that's outside of the court's involvement. And so in those circumstances, they're usually always as is, where is as well, but they're not the court being sold. So you don't need a court's permission to approve a sale. It just becomes the bank's property. The second thing that happens is if it's a high ratio situation, CMHC situation, they would obtain what's called a default judgment or deficiency judgment. The deficiency judgment is basically the difference between the loan total and what the appraised value is. And that's a personal debt that gets registered against the borrower, and the bank can collect as they normally would as if it was a credit card or any other debt. But effectively, the property is transferred to the bank in that situation, and the individual living there is usually evicted.
Right. We see the CMHC one. It's pretty rare that CMHC takes a loss, but we do see it occasionally where you see a CMHC claim on the does that become a court of Queen's Bench claim at that point?
It's King's Bench now, but they're all done. So even if you bring a foreclosure, the foreclosure is through King's Bench as a regular action. It's just a special type of debt collection. So yeah, it would continue on after the property sold. I think you're right. I don't think there are a lot of, there certainly aren't as many CMHC short sales for houses. We saw them a lot for condos because a lot of condominiums lost value over the last 5-10 years. Whereas, a townhome or a house generally either increases in value or retains its value. So provided the bank takes early enough steps to kind of stem the bleeding, those properties generally would have enough to cover any losses associated with it. And this is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of enforcement on guarantees when it comes to commercial loans as well. Because if you buy an industrial space or a multifamily space, or even like duplexes, or you buy side-by-side duplexes, those generally maintain their value. And so when the property is sold in a foreclosure, there wouldn't be any deficiency that you'd go after a guarantor for. And so it's not as common as people think. It certainly is a risk, and when it's triggered, it is triggered pretty significantly. But it really depends on what your structure of your deal looks like.
So pandemic we made some major changes in different ownership and properties, and was there an actual increase in foreclosures, do you think, since the pandemic?
Short answer is there were increases. You did see, though, during the pandemic, a lot of payment vacations. And so this is available for most lenders, like it's in their standard terms,
right,
whereby you can negotiate a provision and say, I lost my job because of COVID, and interest still accrues, but it pauses your requirement to pay for a certain amount of months. And in those circumstances, a lot of people ended up selling and kind of entering the rental market as opposed to riding out the foreclosure. And so you did see more of them. It wasn't as much as you might think on the private side of things. And also it's quite strange. It's a phenomena that we see often. People will often pay no debts except their house, right? And so, they'll stop making car payments, but they'll still pay their mortgage. They'll stop making maintenance enforcement payments, but they'll still be paying their house off. It's the last creditor that usually gets stiffed is the person who could take your house. So
yeah, it's always interesting to watch. We tell clients, I guess, basically, let us know if something's happening, because the last thing the bank wants to be is in owning property, right? Other than major property. They don't want your house if they don't have to. So if you have something coming up, they'll let us know and put you in the right direction at least. We do a fair bit of work with FFP as well, right? So we collaborate with them sometimes to hopefully get people pointed in the right direction before they have to come to you. So, or the bank send something to you as well. So, but it's a reality of life. It's different in every province. We've seen that over the years. Saskatchewan's a whole nother set of rules.
Yes, and what's strange about Saskatchewan is that they have such robust farm protections that your home quarter of your farm is probably more secure than any property you'll see in Alberta. in your ability to foreclose. It's generally blocked unless you get special permission from the government to do it. And it's a couple of hoops to jump through. But yeah, I mean, it is a unfortunate part of borrowing, but it can be navigated if you kind of take steps quickly with relatively limited penalties to you. I've had the biggest problem I see with foreclosures is that people get scared and they ignore it. That's the biggest problem. And so I hate getting calls on a Monday morning saying, "Help, I have to go to court tomorrow morning. They're going to take my house." And it's at that point there's nothing you can do. You will have been 8 to 10 months into the process at that time. There's nothing you can do to stop that from happening. Whereas if it's, I've received a demand letter from my bank, they're threatening foreclosure. What do I do? Well, at that point, there's a lot of options available to you that can basically stop all the negative parts of it, or at least most of the negative parts of it in the long run.
Yeah, it's we get those 6 months behind. We go like, what have they sent you in the mail? Yeah, is by that point, right? So, but anyways, I want to thank you for your time today, Brandon. That's some great information to pass on to not only to the brokers that chime in with us every couple of weeks, and of course we also feed these out into our newsletters as well, so that I think there's something like 22,000 newsletters that go collectively from the team. So a lot of them add those in as well for general information, should you be in that situation. So
for sure.
Again, thanks for your time.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening today. I hope you found the information that we provided to be useful in your mortgage journey. And remember, you can always find our associates at www.brokersforlife.ca/associates. Have a great day.